President Donald Trump responded with moral equivalence, and that was wrong. There is no moral equivalence when it comes to terrorism. There is no shade of gray. It is a black and white issue. When it comes time to convincing this administration that what happened in Kashmir is also an American interest, it's important to remember that Americans also died at Lashkar-e-Taiba hands in Mumbai in 2008. And when you track the number of Pakistani funerals that coincided with the end of the fight in Afghanistan, there is absolutely no question that Pakistan was involved in the deaths of dozens, if not hundreds, of Americans. When you consider that in Afghanistan, all of the fertilizer precursors, I'm sorry, not all, 90% of the fertilizer precursors used in Taliban improvised explosive devices, 90% of them came from one of two different Pakistani factories. This notion that the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency didn't know what was going on is absolute nonsense. Another reason why this is important, and the Congressman referred to this in a different way, is we already see the beginnings of ISI terrorism in the United States itself. That's what the Khalistan movement is about, and we need to recognize that it's not an organic indigenous movement, that it is directed out of Pindi and Islamabad. Now, what I worry about when it comes to the immediate reaction that we see both in the United States, but also to some extent in India, is that self-deterrence is as much of a green light as Asim Munir's jugular speech in the days before. When you self-deter, it convinces the aggressors that they can quite literally get away with murder. It doesn't lead them to pull back and become less aggressive. It encourages them to benefit more from terrorism. Now, I'm a historian by training, and two instances come to mind that involve the United States, which I think India could derive inspiration from now. I'll do this a little bit achronologically. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush was unsure initially how he was going to react. After all, Iraq had the 5th largest army in the world. Talk about self-deterrence. There was a real belief that they also had chemical weapons and so forth. And Margaret Thatcher, who had a personal relationship with George H.W. Bush, called up George H.W. Bush and said quite publicly, "Don't go wobbly on me now, George." Now the relationship, the personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump is even tighter than what we saw between Margaret Thatcher and George H.W. Bush. What we need is Prime Minister Modi not to simply call once, but to call repeatedly, and maybe not publicly, but give the message, "Don't go wobbly on me now, Don." There is absolutely no excuse for the United States not to stand up for its top allies and the world's largest democracy. Now, going back in time to 1988, we all remember the Lockerbie bombing. It was a precursor to what we saw with regard to the 1985 Air India bombing. Now, not a precursor, a post-cursor. Yeah, this is why I didn't become an English teacher. At any rate, well, first of all, there you have another example of how Pakistan-based terror has a habit of impacting the United States. Expect that article in the next couple days now that I realize it. Now, at any rate, after 1988, the President of the United States was Ronald Reagan, but George H.W. Bush's vice president had just been elected. And Ronald Reagan, we know from the declassified documents, basically said, in my last days in office, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're going to be president. You decide. And what George H.W. Bush decided was, rather than treat the Lockerbie bombing, terrorism, as a military matter, he was going to try to treat it as a diplomatic and a judicial matter, to ramp up sanctions against, in this case, Libya, as well as to put together the forensic evidence. The problem with that is if you consider terrorism to be a judicial matter rather than a military matter, you're always looking to pick up the pieces after the attack. The second problem with that is the momentum and the outrage in the international community that would allow for retaliation dissipates with time. And so if you mull options for too long, you actually enable the perpetrators of terrorism to get away with it. And for years, Muammar Gaddafi was able to remain in power. Now, of course, Muammar Gaddafi fell out of power in 2011. He should have fallen out of power in 1988, after the Lockerbie attack. Now, so Modi must call President Trump repeatedly. There will be some military, there's valid military response, and I'll get into that in a second. But the response shouldn't only be military. If people say, well, we don't want a military response, we're afraid, we'll get them to sign on immediately to some of the other responses. Why, for example, on May 9th, is the International Monetary Fund going to be meeting to approve a $1 billion loan to Pakistan, the 25th multi-billion dollar loan? And this comes after March, when Pakistan was given a $1.3 billion loan. Now ask yourself this: if Pakistan needs this $1 billion, is the apparatus of Pakistan's security state and the ISI, does that cost more than $1 billion? The answer is yes. And if that's the case, if Pakistan's nuclear program costs more than $1 billion, and if money is fungible, does Pakistan really need the $1 billion, or is it simply bailing out terrorism after the fact? Now, there's no reason why, objectively speaking, Pakistan should not be designated a state sponsor of terror. Now, I've been on the receiving end of Pakistan's complaints about this, how Pakistanis will always complain that we treat them like a fair weather friend, that we're always sanctioning them when we don't need them, and then we lift sanctions when suddenly the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, or we have 9/11 and so forth, and we need Pakistan. You know what? We do treat them like a fair weather friend. But the response to that is simply not to be their friend, that we shouldn't be lifting the sanctions, which by any objective measure are deserved. But I wouldn't simply stop with designating Pakistan as a state sponsor of terror. I would designate the ISI as a terror group. And there's already a precedent here when it comes to President Donald Trump and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Again, Trump, who admittedly doesn't know the history of the region, and when he's surprised by a question, he is going to utter this inane moral equivalence. But if Prime Minister Modi will confront Trump politely with his own precedents, then there's absolutely no reason not to designate the ISI to be a terrorist group. Let me just conclude with a couple other options. Of course, terrorism, I worked in the George W. Bush administration, and the problem with George W. Bush's so-called global war on terrorism is that terrorism is a tactic. It's not an ideology, and it's an ideology which drives the ISI. When it comes to terrorism, the calculation behind the tactic is simple. It's a cost-benefit analysis. Do we gain more from conducting these acts of terrorism than we lose in terms of the retaliation? And therefore, the key to countering terrorism is to raise the cost to that terrorism. So I would ask you, if the ports of Hodeidah and Bandar Abbas can go boom in the night, why can't the port of Gwadar or Karachi? It doesn't need to have a claim of responsibility to it. And when it comes to Gwadar, let's also not kid ourselves. Pakistan is not really an independent state anymore. It's a satrapy of China. And China has been encouraging Pakistan, China has been encouraging Bangladesh, and trying to encircle India. In addition, let me just conclude with some advice to Asim Munir. You saw what happened to Qasem Soleimani. What I would say, not only to Asim Munir, but actually to his aides, is that no one should get into a car with him right now. No one should get within 30 meters of his car. If you do, you're taking your own life into your own hands. That, rather than moral equivalence, should be the theme of the US response when it comes to what happened in Kashmir. Thank you.
Wow.